Good morning. I'm Nancy Msebi, Project Manager at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Welcome to the Midpoint, an online platform of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in South Africa. Thank you for joining us. CAS is a German political foundation which is closely associated with the Christian Democratic Union. CAS funds projects on the promotion of democracy and strengthening of the rule of law. Recipients of our funding are universities, think tanks, NGOs, and political parties. But funding for political parties is only for capacity training purposes. We also have a scholarship program for Masters in Humanities. This program is limited to studies at Wits or UCT. It is combined with an internship at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Today, we are pleased to host the first virtual launch of the newly released book, Westhuizen and Democracy in South Africa, by Professor Roger Southall. In 2016, Professor Southall wrote a book titled The New Black Middle Class in South Africa, which was published by Jacana Media and funded by CAS. While the book was well received, there were also comments like, what does a white man know about the black middle class? He must write about his own people. So I guess Roger took the advice and decided to write this book. Westhuizen and Democracy asks the following questions. What is the place and role of whites in South Africa today? Are whites genuinely willing participants in a non-racial democracy, willing to forego the racial privileges of the past? Have they proved reluctant to relinquish power? We have a lot of food for thought for a lively discussion. We'll share the marketing details of the book in the chat room. We promote freedom of speech, and our panelists will try to answer as many questions as they possibly can. But I would like to appeal to everyone to treat our panelists with courtesy. We have received positive feedback on our social media platforms, but we also received unsavory comments as well. This space is for critical debate and not for personal attacks. Let me take this opportunity to thank our esteemed panelists, Professor Roger Southall, Professor Christi van der Westhuizen, and our moderator, Joanne Joseph. Joanne is a respected author. Her latest book is Children of Sugarcane. She's a media presenter with 25 years of experience in the industry. She has been an afternoon drive talk show host on Talk Radio 702 and has presented several news and current affairs shows over the years on the SABC and ENCA. Joanne has a bachelor's degree in English, drama, and film, and her honors and master's degrees in modern languages, literature, and media from Wits University. She is currently studying towards a PhD in African literature at Wits. I will now hand over to Joanne.
Oh dear.
It seems Joanne has a problem with the connection.
Nancy,
so
all of you with thing, and as Nancy has mentioned, we're going to be looking into this book, Westhuizen and Democracy in South Africa.
Joanne, the line is very bad. I think maybe just try and switch off the camera. And yes.
Nancy, we hear?
No, we can't hear you. You're breaking. Let me rather continue introducing Professor Southall and Professor Christi van der Westhuizen, and Joanne will try and reconnect.
I'm going to try.
Professor Roger Southall is Emeritus Professor in Sociology at the University of the Witwatersrand and Professorial Research Associate, Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS. His books include Liberation Movements in Power, Party and State in Southern Africa and the New Black Middle Class, which I already mentioned. But he has a whole long list of books. So if we now start, mention all of them, we'll be here until tomorrow. And Professor Christi van der Westhuizen is an award-winning columnist, public speaker, and commentator in local and international media. She works as Associate Professor at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, CANRAD, at Nelson Mandela University. Democracy and difference, including race, are keen research interests of hers, and she recently published the Routledge International Handbook of Critical Studies in Whiteness as co-editor with Shona Hunter in 2022. She's also the author of White Power and the Rise and Fall of the National Party, and Sitting Pretty, White Africans Women in Post-Apartheid South Africa. She held associateships with the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town, amongst others, and previously she worked as Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Pretoria. I will now hand over to Roger to give us a bit of context about the book. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Nancy. I'll start off by minding my P's and Q's by saying thanks very much for the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for all the assistance they've given in this book. It was particularly important because the book is structured around 8 focus groups which were held around the country before COVID set in, fortunately, or else they wouldn't have happened. So without those, the book would be a lot poorer. But particular thanks to Nancy and to Dr. Henning Suhr, who was the director of Konrad Adenauer at the time. Okay, so why on earth study whites? Well, I think there are some very good reasons. And the first real reason is that if you go back to the literature of about, 30, 40 years ago, the academic literature and a lot of the political literature coming out of the Western states who are looking at South Africa with a mixture of horror and concern was that there was going to be a violent revolution and a race war and so on and so forth. I'm just going to give you an important quote which raises this issue from a magnificent book written in 1981 by George Frederickson, who compared white supremacy in South Africa with white supremacy in the United States. And he has a paragraph in there. He says, "But the nature of this place will depend on the decisions that the white leadership makes in the years to come when faced with increasing pressures from within South Africa and without to dismantle apartheid and enfranchise the African majority. Intransigent opposition to these demands for basic change will only invite race war and could ultimately result in the oppression or even the expulsion of the white community by victorious African nationalists. Accommodation, a willingness to share power and economic resources in an equitable way might still enable the whites to survive as members of a permanent and useful minority within a multiracial state. The history of white supremacy in South Africa provides little hope for such an outcome. But one of the more general lessons of history is that human groups can sometimes transcend the past and adapt to circumstances in unanticipated ways. If enlightened self-interest can induce whites to abdicate their privileged position, they may still be able to call themselves South Africans 25, 50, or even 100 years hence. Otherwise, they may end up in the same situation in which non-whites now find themselves, or as disenfranchised aliens in the land of their birth." And he goes on to stress that the whole issue of if there was to be some form of non-violent transition, that some form of economic redistribution will be absolutely essential to maintain the relative political stability of whites necessary to ensure white survival. So I think there are very good reasons to study whites and democracy in South Africa now that we've had 25 odd years of democracy. And first of all, I want to stress, one has to say, you cannot generalize about whites as a whole. Whites are homogenous as any other group in society, and we know all the stuff about race being socially constructed and so forth. So I'm not going to dwell on that. But my principal question, I think, was how have whites adapted to democracy and how do they participate in our political life? And I centered my probing around the issue about whether whites would become what I termed reluctant Democrats. I've been asked to do a quick overlook of the book, which is a bit daunting, so I'm going to skip a lot, but I'm just going to mention that I deal with, after providing an historical introduction, which I think is absolutely essential to understand where whites are coming, I take an extended look at how whites participated or did not participate in the TRC when it was held, because that sets up a chapter where I look at what whites are thinking about the TRC now. And this was drawn very much from the focus groups around the country. And it looked at issues about transitional justice and reconciliation, obviously. It asked questions about, was apartheid a crime against humanity? It looked at issues of white complicity and related issues. And I found 25 years on, the responses to the TRC were, I think, first of all, reflective, which was very comforting. They were diverse. I can't go, I'm quite happy to answer questions about this, but how do we assess all the answers? Because I would want to raise a couple of issues, is that how do we assess such answers in the present era? Because now the TRC literally is history. A lot of people have grown up. Quite a lot of the young people who participate in the focus groups were either not born or very young at the time of the TRC. So the TRC is history. How do we remember it? People remember it in different ways. They won't remember it by chapter or verse. They will have a very general impression. We need to look at the generation gap and so on. And generally speaking, there was no unambiguous white view. What was positive, I think, was that generally there was an admission of the wrongness of apartheid. And there was an admission that apartheid was a crime against humanity, even though there was not an understanding of actually what is meant in international legal terms by what is meant by a crime against humanity. There were still quite a lot of the old tropes about apartheid originally having had good intentions and having gone astray, and a lot of blame was put on the political leadership of the time. There was a very interesting discussion about whether whites were complicit, and the answers were diverse. But I think there was quite a lot of shifting onto the blame to the government and to the leaders of the security services. I look at the hopes and fears of white South Africans. 1994, I focus upon what the Constitution gave them. It was a compromise constitution, we all know that. I look at the rights of property, schooling and language, which were particularly important to whites. And my broad intimation of the economic data is that despite the fact there have been a lot of changes, there is no huge, great material reason for white discontent. There have been some subgroups which have suffered. There's a lot of resentment about what is termed reverse racism, but generally white prosperity has not gone down the tubes. Two other chapters are based on the focus groups, two chapters which I call Dissolution and Dystopia, where basically people reflect on how they feel that South Africa is going downhill at the moment. I have a subsection called Democracy, the Impossible Choice, where people air their doubts about whether democracy is possible in this country, given where we are. There's a lot of concern, which we all know about. We read it in the newspapers the whole time, about affirmative action and BEE, and that is interpreted as reverse action. There's a lot of fear and about crime and violence, even if we know that fear, crime and violence is worse in the predominantly black areas. There is also an optimistic chapter, relatively optimistic chapter, where you find that most white South Africans are staying put. They want to stay living here. They're relatively happy here. Many acknowledge the relative privilege they have. And there's an interesting debate about political participation. And there was an interesting discussion about whether they think they are reluctant Democrats. And I just got, if I may, just another short quotation, which gives something of the flavor of these discussions. Somebody said, and I think it's one of the more thoughtful answers, I think everyone is a reluctant Democrat in this country because it doesn't matter what you vote for, nobody is satisfied. Nobody is getting like what they want. Taxpayers feel they're getting completely drained. The unemployed don't have any work. The people who are affected by crime don't see criminals getting locked up. Everybody participates, but nobody is satisfied. And I go on to comment that I think for anybody from any particular background could have given that answer. So that raises all sorts of questions. We can come back to that. I do chapters on the Democratic Alliance about its problems with attracting black politicians and black voters. And I have a detailed chapter about Afrikaners after apartheid, which again, I think was one of the more interesting and enjoyable chapters to write. And I based the issue there about whether Afrikaners are retreating or engaging with the new politics in this country. And I look at four major political responses, as first of all as armed opposers, who basically got finished off in the early period with being shot up in Bophuthatswana, and some of the more extremist groups being taken out by the security forces by about 1996. I look at passive resistors. In other words, those who resist, they're not running around with placards, and they're not running around with guns, but they are acquiescence does not mean acceptance. They're unhappy, but they're just getting on with it. Immigration versus internal migration, what Christi has termed enclave nationalism. And I deal with inclusive opponents, in other words, what you might call Afrikaner-born frees, and active proponents. I'm looking at how organizations like AfriForum, the De Klerk Foundation, and Solidarity engage with the politics in this country by using the institutions. Sometimes you could say it overlaps with the general interest, otherwise it's much more particular to Afrikaners or whites in general. I have a chapter on whites as citizens. I look at the politics of representation. One of the important things there is that whites participate politically in terms of voting. They tend to be more conservative in their voting. But what is interesting is that if you look at their voting trends over the last 25 years, they are more conservative, but if you look at the ups and downs, their voting behavior is not dissimilar those of all South Africans. We can come back to that. The politics of recognition, the one thing that I would raise, and I'm sure this will come up, I suggest that explicit racism is receding, but it may be going into private realms. I think that is something very difficult to assess. A lot of the stuff we see in the media is about what goes on social media, which I don't participate in social media very much at all. But it generally is reporting the ugly things that do go on in social media. How you judge whether those are representative or not, I don't know. It's beyond my understanding. I look at the politics of redistribution. I suggest that there is a limited, and politics of redistribution is obviously extremely important. I look at the limited scope for redistribution offered by the tax system, because the tax base of income tax payers is, unfortunately, as we know, very, very thin, and it seems to be going down rather than going up. There is a real issue, I suggest, about the very concept of reparations. I can come back to if people want to. And I suggest that actually we need to pursue a program of social justice rather than something called reparations, except in very specific circumstances. And I suggest that our politics around how we reorganize the economics of this country they've gone polar. On the ANC statism on the one hand and the economics on the Liberals on the other, and we're not getting anywhere. Lastly, I say, is there white in the rainbow? And I look at the notion of I call it the relative success of a failed settler state. I think we need to go back to this notion of South Africa's origins, as we know it today, was as a settler state, of whites coming from far and abroad, largely from the British Empire, and from Holland, of course, originally. But it was seen from 1910 onwards, etc., as a white dominion, as one of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, etc. But whereas those have continued to be white dominated in their politics, in other words, in those countries for the moment, apart from the States, which is up for grabs at the moment, apparently, inverted commas, the whites won. The whites didn't win in South Africa. So I think I'm thinking of it as a failed settler state. But I think in terms of absorbing whites in the last 25 years, all things considered, and where whites have come from, I don't think we've done too badly. So I'm sure there has been no outright triumph, but we have a real, if limited, democracy. What I'd like to stress on that is unraveling history takes generations. And I make several references in the book to what happened in post-war Germany, about how Germans adjusted to the total defeat in the Second World War. And we know that the first generation, perhaps the first two generations, did not want to talk about the war. And it was a later generation which had not experienced, which had grown up in post-war Germany, which said to their mums and dads, we want to know about the war, we want to disassociate ourselves from Nazism. You cannot expect a political change in 1994 to mean there was an immediate change in political attitudes and all whites become wonderful non-racialists. These things take time. Secondly, I would also stress, and I think this is getting lost in a lot of the current debate about the need for dramatic change in this country, don't underestimate the virtues of peace. Let me remind you that when the transition took place in this country, 800,000 people in Rainbow, at the very time 800,000 people in Rwanda, at the very time we were voting, were losing their lives to a genocide. That did not happen here. And a lot of the unpleasant things which go on, I'm afraid, in many other African countries did not happen. We may have displaced the war to Angola and Namibia, but in this country, despite the fact that something like 18,000 lives were lost during the transition, it was relatively peaceful. And I look at the road to non-racialism and what whites need to accept. This is a very speedy overview. There's lots more I could say, but I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thanks very much, Roger. Joanne, would you like to
Roger,
continue?
thank you so much for that. I hope my line is a little bit better now.
Yeah,
Nancy, thank you. I hope you can hear me a bit better and see me better now. Had some technical gremlins creep in this morning. But Christi, I'm going to ask you firstly, before we launch into the panel discussion, to please respond to Roger's overview. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you to Nancy at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for the invitation to participate today. Yeah, I'm very. It was a pleasure to be reading this book over the past couple of weeks. I think it's a much needed contribution at the moment in terms of understanding race in South Africa, understanding whiteness in South Africa, understanding white people in South Africa, and I do think that there's some flattening in our public discourse that frequently happens, where the nuances get lost and the complexities get lost, and that actually is really grist on the mill frequently for opportunistic politicians and so forth. So I think it's very important for us to have this kind of very carefully conducted and thought through research on which to also base our arguments and our engagement with one another as South Africans. And particularly, as we've come to expect from Roger, who, of course, over many decades have actually provided us with dispassionate and also thoughtful research to understand conundrums in our society. We yet again have such a book before us here, and it is very much a nuanced reading. He's looking at what he calls ordinary whites in South Africa in the post-apartheid democracy, and finding them, as he's also mentioned, to be reluctant Democrats, but Democrats nonetheless. And of course, it is very important for white people and for white academics such as Roger and I to be reflecting on our positionalities, as white people in South Africa, as white people in Africa, as white people in a settler state such as South Africa. And this is something that Roger also raises in the book, and I think that this is the kind of self-reflection that has become much more part of our national discourse as well over the past decade or so. As acerbic as the debate gets at times, unfortunately, I think it's also a good thing that we are seeing much greater self-reflexivity among white people, and particularly I think also with in relation to researchers, academics, and so forth. Given that the universities and your knowledge production during colonialism and apartheid were also very much implicated in those very systems, so we need this kind of critical thinking to also be emanating from the ranks of academics specifically in terms of critically interrogating the position of white people. So the basis of the book, I see there is a question around this, is research that's been done in 8 in-depth qualitative focus groups across KwaZulu-Natal, Western Cape, Gauteng, and the Free State. But the book goes actually much further and also discussing and analyzing white people from other vantage points. It gives us an interesting analysis of the state of liberalism, which we know has taken some interesting turns in recent years under the leadership of Helen Zille. We also have a look at how Afrikaner politics has changed, through the eyes of Roger. And there's also a chapter on white people as citizens, exploring the politics of representation through to the politics of redistribution. Roger does wonder at the beginning of the book whether it will be perceived perhaps as controversial or even received with contempt. The fact that he does not opt for easy moralization around white people, and he does not simply fall into that dichotomy of white people being necessarily simply bad. His study contributes to the findings of other studies, most notably Melissa Stein's a very important book of 2001 about whiteness isn't what it used to be. And also my own work and some other work that's been done on whiteness in South Africa. And basically what a lot of this work has been emphasizing over the decades is that there's a variation in the political positionalities of white people. And this is important because Roger's also alluded to it, that one should be guarding against the homogenization of whiteness, because that can be, as Ashu Mbembe has warned, easily turn into kind of a fetishization of whiteness. And then you risk collapsing into a regime of race essentialism. And we have actually seen this in recent writings where in a kind of a colonial reversal, we're seeing attempts to try and exclude white people now from the definition of humanity. Foreclosing whiteness in such a way, for me, is to foreclose possibilities of humanization of all people beyond race, which is something that this question comes up quite a bit in the book as well, this question of moving beyond race and whether that's a possibility, particularly if we look at the idea of non-racialism. So whiteness as a structural status does not consist of a singular way of being white, or more accurately, of doing whiteness. People who are racialized as white do not occupy simply one position. As has been said also in masculinity studies, it's important not to also get stuck at the abstraction of whiteness, but to, like when you're looking in masculinity studies, to speak not only of masculinities, but of men. And similarly also not to speak only of whiteness, but to speak of white people. And when we do intersectional analysis from a critical vantage point, we can see how fractured whiteness is when we look at what is called subjectivities in the academy. Basically, when we're looking at the intersections with ethnicity, class, gender, and sexuality. Whiteness actually divides its subjects. So the individuals who are racialized as white are actually subject to a kind of internal stratification through intricate regimes of domination, which include economic regimes, heteronormative regimes, patriarchal regimes, and so forth. In South Africa's case, we are dealing with an unusual settler class, as Jonathan Hislop has also written, compared to those in the USA, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And this, namely in the sense that this is a settler class that has relinquished power, or as Herman Gillemier would also have it, abdicated power. Some Afrikaners are still resentful about this. But interestingly, in this study, Roger actually finds limited nostalgia for the apartheid past among his respondents. Also, not a single respondent actually expressed the desire to return to the apartheid dispensation, which I think is worth noting. As Roger shows in his book, whites have accepted democracy. While this might seem like an underwhelming statement to make, as Roger also emphasizes, we should be reminded that this idea of an inclusive democracy in which all South Africans enjoy equal citizenship status was completely anathema to ruling white elites for decades. And in fact, we are aware of the violent lengths that the settler state actually went to sustain its dominance. As late as in the second half of the 1980s, then the ruling National Party had absolutely no intention to give up white power. And this is something that we do need to remind ourselves of. If we look at the outcome of the referendum in 1992, we see that the de Klerk speech of 1990 wasn't just a political elite decision among white people, but it was actually supported by a popular position of white people realizing that they need to shift in relation to white domination. And therefore, South Africa is now, as Roger puts it quite nicely, a failed settler state. So in this failure is an important failure. There are massive liberating possibilities in this failure of this settler state. It opens up the possibilities for justice and human dignity in South Africa. Those who lose sight of this actually also lose sight of the potentialities that have been created. But the point is definitely not to congratulate white people. So that's definitely something that one must caution against. Historical conditions, mostly beyond white people's control, forced a rethink of their political positions. We always had a small group of white people across time who were critical of the dominant system of white domination. But this sustained white dissidence against colonialism and apartheid is actually not the focus of this book. We are looking in this book at particularly at ordinary so-called ordinary whites. So what is important at this stage is given the immense benefit that white people unjustly drew from colonialism and apartheid, what is the important thing that comes up now is the necessity of a culture of responsibility among white people. So Roger asked important questions of his respondents, also in relation to whether formal political equality can be moved to a further point of progression to social and economic equality. I think the biggest critique, as we know today in South Africa, is about the fact that formal political equality has not sufficiently translated into socioeconomic equality for the majority of Black people. And Roger quotes also the well-known stats that we have that show the incredible disparity in wealth, which has got a strong racial character. As we know, the bottom half of our population, people who are mired in poverty, are Black people. And this remains the big challenge that we are faced with still. So this question is about, it puts a finger on the rising discontent with continued white control of economic levers, even as the political levers of the state are in Black people's hands. The continued white control opens the door for political opportunists who seek to exploit what is very much a reasonable outrage about these continuing inequalities, but to exploit these for nefarious, frequently highly personal gains. So, interestingly and importantly, white people in the study are willing to admit to the wrongness of apartheid. There's also a sense of relief about the shift to democracy in the 1990s. But what I find worrying is the fact that there's still, among these respondents, there's still a resistance to the idea of the correction of these disparities through concerted policies, such as broad-based Black economic empowerment. And Roger also quotes stats that shows you that even though, of course, we know that we haven't alleviated the condition of half of our population, we have seen a progression in terms of a growth of the middle class, of many more Black people entering also into corporates and so forth, and that kind of transformation. But what I find worrying is that the respondents in the study still didn't support the idea of employment equity, which is our version of affirmative action, and still didn't support the idea of Black economic empowerment, and found it to be what so-called reverse racism. So it's very worrying that white people at this point in time still can hold positions like that. Because the question that comes up, and Roger also does a good discussion on it, how do we do reparations? How do we do redistribution? What would that look like? Also, particularly in the context now of a state that is increasingly struggling to provide both services and to sustain infrastructure. So, what would it look like to provide reparations, and to adjust this absolutely unsustainable socioeconomic inequality that we have? And then finally, what I do appreciate of the book is also a further fleshing out of non-racialism. Non-racialism I regard as South Africa's unique contribution to the global struggle against racism. It is an old idea which has come a long way, more than 100 years. It has definitely met with some political headwinds in recent times. So Roger actually takes it to a kind of he fleshes it out with particular references to the socioeconomic dimension of non-racialism. Because when we think of non-racialism, we may think, oh, well, this has only got to do with the identitary dimension, the social categorization of race. But no, he talks about addressing racial equality, he talks about the property question, he talks about the eradication of Black people's poverty, alongside the strengthening of the commitment to democracy and advancing interracial inclusivity. So just to end off then, the big challenge remaining is that one of the fact that inequality in South Africa racial inequality has a strong socioeconomic dimension to it. Redistribution remains the most urgent challenge that we have not actually lived up to, and I include the ANC in this. And what we need now is white people also thinking much more innovatively in terms of how they can use their resource bases that they still, to a large extent, enjoy, how they can use that to advance socioeconomic justice in our country. And I will leave it at that for a moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christi. Thanks, Roger. We really have a lot of food for thought. Unfortunately, Joanne is still struggling. She, however, sent the questions that she's preparing. It's quite a lot. So I must just click, it from the start that these are not my questions. Joanne is the one who really did the hard work. She read the whole book, page to page, just trying to come out with questions that we can engage on.
There she is.
So I think she's managed now. Joanne, would you like to continue?
Oh.
Joanne, can you hear us?
And if you hear me, a bit of trouble with my line.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Hear you.
Okay. Would you like to continue? Then we'll see how it goes. Otherwise, I continue with the questions.
What a shame.
Yeah.
All right, that's fine. So Roger from, and if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, I hope, Colleen, and it was just a question about the photo you quoted. I wanted to know whether those focus pertained to whites across all provinces and all. She may have missed that.
Yeah, I think that the organisation of the focus groups and the conduct of them is done by citizen surveys.
Give us an answer on that.
Sorry, they were done by citizen surveys, a very established social survey firm in Cape Town. They went around the country, all 4 provinces, as Christi mentioned, and they divided and they drew from diverse socio-economic groups. I mentioned that, broadly speaking, overwhelming, we might say that the white participants were, in a very broad sense, and I'm not going to go into definition, the middle class. I don't think we got the very bottom, and I don't think we certainly didn't get the very top. We didn't have any of the Oppenheimer family in our focus groups, unfortunately. And we didn't go recruiting from the white beggars at the traffic lights. So I think we may have missed the top and the bottom, but as Christi said, I opt for this very highly unscientific term, ordinary whites. But they were divided by socio-economic group. And I wasn't able to differentiate by class very much, but generally speaking, I think you found most of the more liberal and forward-looking responses coming from the better off components of the focus groups. And it was very marked that you might say the most conservative and the most fundamentalist were from those focus groups we held in Bloemfontein.
Roger, you've done some very interesting recapping of history here, including about the fractious relationship between the Boers and the British, particularly after the South African War. It must have taken some work to unite those two sides under the kind of white nationalism required in order to facilitate the ideology that would lay the foundation for apartheid.
Yes, I mean, I go back to the history because I think it's very important to understand it. I think the key issue, which I point out in that chapter, is that before 1910, before Union, the political engagement of black people some black people, not many, in the Cape were unable to vote. But basically what you get at Union is a definition of a definition of citizenship by race. And very much the so-called people who are unable to vote under the Cape Franchise were there very much on sufferance. And as we know that they were going to be then going to lose their vote in 1936, and subsequently coloureds were to lose those coloureds who could vote were going to lose their votes in the early 1950s through a whole other set of constitutional manipulations. So I think that what comes out of that history is yes, there was a very real struggle between what I call conciliatory and, I've forgotten the other term, but the conciliatory trend was, Smuts was, let's English-speaking and Afrikaners get together, and the other term, which I've forgotten, which I use, is cultural nationalism. Those two polarities were very real in right through to essentially 1994. And I trace those actually into the varying dimensions which you get, the varying, very different political responses you get amongst Afrikaners today. The conciliatory tradition and the cultural nationalism tradition are very much still alive in that sort of political thinking.
Christi, we know that Roger has spent quite a bit of time in this book on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, its legacy in our democracy. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, I think, the jury's out on whether it did effectively succeed in solving all the issues and the particular cases around human rights abuses, killings, disappearances during apartheid. But there are still calls for prosecution in cases that were not solved. Do you think that's a fair call during democracy, or could revisiting these cases do more harm than good for our social cohesion society?
There was...
Thanks, Joanne.
Yeah, go for it.
Just firstly, I do think that, Roger, you found that your respondents didn't actually support the idea of prosecutions at this stage, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And that's quite interesting. And because of this argument that some white people have made around that the foot soldiers had to carry the brunt of prosecutions, particularly now with reference usually to Eugene de Kock, and not the leaders who actually gave the instructions for these attacks and murders and extreme violence that we now know of. So, but Joanne, to answer your question, I do think that it has been a grave omission in our post-apartheid democracy that we have not instituted proper prosecutions. And it would seem, in fact, it came out last year, if I'm not mistaken, that there was some kind of elite deal that was made from between the ANC and the National Party that actually that there won't be proper prosecutions, and I think that if you look at other societies, particularly fascist, if we think of the Nazis, if we think of the Italians, the fascist Italians, and so forth, the fact is that you see a rise again in fascism and ultranationalism and those kinds of destructive political phenomena, frequently also that are based frequently on racism and xenophobia and so forth. You see a rise in those kinds of destructive political phenomena, also where justice hasn't been seen to have been done. So, and that's the problem with not actually prosecuting where you have enough evidence to prosecute. So I think we've made a mistake, and it's, I don't think it's too late. I think that we can rectify that. Whether there's a political will to do that with our current political elite, of course, is the other question.
And we've got a question from Simpiwe Msizi, who says, what do you mean about marginalization of whites? Who is marginalizing them in South Africa? I do not think anyone does marginalize any grouping, except the said grouping may put that on themselves. Whites who are interacting practically with other races are treated well.
I think that's directed. Yeah, I think that was directed at Christi. I'm reading that one. I don't think I ever used the term people were marginalizing whites. But I think we need to go back to what Christi's been saying about the debate more recently. I think race has entered the debate in a much more explicit way, in a much more polarized way over the last few years as the economy has suffered enormous difficulties. And I can see that that is going to carry on the more that our economy is failing to provide the basic services, let alone anything else, to a significant majority of the population. And I think it is so urgent that we address the whole question of socio-economic justice. And it's a very, there are no easy answers. And I stress in the book there are simply no easy answers. So Cyril Ramaphosa may not be having much success at it, but I think one thing that in spirit I agree with is that unless we have some form of consensus, we are not going to get there. I think that political polarization is not a recipe for solving our economic problems. We have to have some form of consensus to move forward. And I suggest that, as I said earlier, ANC statism, which is centered around, unfortunately, running an incapable state. And the suggestion that the ANC can turn this economy around by continuing to run SOEs into the ground is a non-starter. So we need to change that. Economic liberalism, on the other hand, you may increase economic growth if you suddenly open up the economy to all comers and without any other protections whatsoever. You may get more economic growth, but you are simply going to replicate racial inequality. And you're going to, what is happening in countries all around the world, as we've seen from the work of Thomas Piketty, is that you get the growth of a large underclass, which doesn't get the benefits of the growth whatsoever. So we have to form some agreement if we are going to move forward in this country. And unfortunately, at the moment, I think we are too busy politically polarizing rather than trying to address our problems. I don't know how we're going to get out of it. Some people suggest that if we have a coalition government henceforward, I don't know. I just put the problem out there. It's something which we urgently need to address. And I think taking strongly ideological positions is probably not very helpful.
We are out. I've got about 5 minutes left, so I want to try to get 2 more questions in at least. And Christi asked you about this. I think it's an important aspect of the book, Roger's exploration of whites and social racism in the black races has gone backstage post-democracy. I really like that a lot. I mean, we've got people like Terry Oakley Smith, watching today, diversity expert, who tell you anti-racism over the decades has morphed into far more, especially in social situations.
Is that for me or Christi?
Christi?
Me? Oh, sorry. Okay,
I think it's for you, Roger.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, I think this one is very, very, very difficult to judge.
It's for you, Christi. I don't know you.
How? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll answer it. I think this issue of whether we have more racism or less racism may be the wrong way of looking at the issue. Let us accept we have a highly divided society racially. And I suspect that if you look at the way the forms that racialism takes across the decades, it changes. So I think we need to be looking at the qualitative aspect of racism and how it is expressed or not expressed, rather than saying, is there more or is there less? The thrust of what I'm saying in the book is that racism in South Africa today has been rendered politically and legally illegitimate and illegal. And that, I think, is a very considerable gain to what we had previously. If you go back to South Africa of the 1940s or 50s, it in many ways was a different world. Black people getting pushed off pavements, and for God's sake, we have some terrible incidents, but on the whole, that has gone. That is a massive gain. It doesn't mean that racism, as I suggest, may have receded into private spaces. But do all whites, when they get round a braai, have nothing to talk about race? No. It varies across the population. But generally, I would suggest, and I maybe have rose-tinted spectacles, but I think that people recognize the illegitimacy of race, and I don't know, I don't want this to be taken the wrong way. I think it's better for people to be civil to each other. I think that is a tremendous gain. How much racism out there, I think is very difficult to tell. But I think we should not get into platitudes about whites are just as racist as they were before. Things are different. Things have changed.
Christi, can I put a last question to you as to what is a fair expectation in terms of the contribution of white South Africans in nation building within the context of a constitutional democracy such as ours?
Well, white people, as Roger also shows in the book, still have a very strong economic base. This is white privilege is real as a socio-economic phenomenon in South Africa. It is based on the undue privileging of white people during the colonial and the apartheid periods, and therefore there's a special responsibility that rests on white people to think innovatively in terms of how resources can be redistributed. Our poverty problem, and now after the COVID, we're actually not after we're in the COVID-19 pandemic. If we think of the incredible socioeconomic burden, to put it mildly, that's been placed on people, and the incredible fact that we have, before the pandemic, we had a quarter of children being stunted due to malnutrition. That is absolutely unconscionable in a country like this with the kind of wealth that exists. I see Terry Oakley-Smith actually asked a question about relative privilege. So for me, relative privilege would I don't know how Roger means it, but how I would understand it, it would actually be the idea of the extreme inequalities that we have in our country. So if we also look at in a relative way at poverty, not just by itself, but you look in relation to the wealth that exists in our country, it's absolutely unconscionable. And white people have actually managed to navigate the democratic landscape quite well. I think a lot of white people are busy with good work and important work, but definitely by far not enough. And one wants to have much more concerted thinking, also because we have a state that at the moment is not capable actually of doing the kind of redistribution that we require. What has happened so far has not been enough. But one wants initiative from white people, concerted initiative from white people, and it will have to take an organizational form of sorts.
Christi, thank you so much for that. And I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave the discussion for today. because we've run out of time, but I've no doubt it will continue in many spaces outside this forum. This is the book that you need to get if this topic captured your interest. Whites and Democracy in South Africa by Professor Roger Southall. That is what it looks like. Roger and Professor Christi van der Westhuizen, thank you so much for your deep insights into this complex subject matter. Thank you for watching from home, for your questions and your comments. Apologies for some of the technical problems that we had during this broadcast. But from me, Joanne Joseph, and our host, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, do take care. Thank you for participating.